Thank you so much, John, for that wonderful introduction, and thanks to the audience for that warm welcome. I am absolutely delighted to be here in such an important forum, and I want to thank Nikolai, wherever he is, for his wonderful work in organizing this. And Skip, thank you so much for hosting me. My only regret is that I had only an appetizer tour of this wonderful facility for 45 minutes, so I'm looking forward to coming back for the main event, and not to mention dessert. So I hope that there will be many return opportunities. I am dressing to match my book cover. I had absolutely nothing to do with the book cover design, and I have to say, we all know the old adage, you should not judge a book by its cover, but I was so impressed when I was presented with this design. It is not only visually arresting, but it really succinctly captures so much of the essence of my message. And we all know that a picture is worth 1,000 words. In this case, many more than 1,000 words. So obviously, there's something that is connotative of Nazism, right? Which is very much in our minds, both historically and presently, when we think about hate speech. It looks like a placard. It kind of connotes either a poster or an armband. And that word hate, which is the title of the book, is so pronounced and so strong. It's so looming. It has been of such growing concern in this country in the recent past. And yet, when my husband first saw the book cover, he said, well, you know, it's a little bit hard to read that word hate. It's a little bit too overcome by the subtitle. And I said, that's brilliant. That is exactly the message that I want to convey. I do believe that hate not only must, but can be suppressed. And it will be, and I use a more active verb, resisted, and that will be through free speech and not censorship. And even though I've been teaching constitutional law for several decades now, I'm embarrassed to say it wasn't until I asked to meet with the book designer, I was so impressed, he pointed out to me the choice of font here. Now, do you recognize that this is the font in which the Constitution itself is written? So the symbolism was really, really wonderful. And the bottom line, so the only verb in the title is resist. This book, although it is an opposition to censorship, even more so is a call to arms, to affirmatively raise our voices, to counter hate and discrimination and stereotyping. And I especially believe, and this is consistent with the ACLU's mission statement and policy positions, that those of us who oppose censoring hate speech have a special responsibility to raise our voices, to do whatever we can to advocate non-censorial responses, which I believe are not only more consistent with individual liberty and democracy, but actually are more effective in countering hatred and discrimination. And that so the bottom line message is we do not have to choose between liberty and equality. We do not have to choose between civil liberties and civil rights. They are mutually reinforcing. And that is a message that has been propounded not only by the ACLU, but also by all of the major civil rights organizations throughout history. Some of the strongest advocates for freedom of speech have been those who were warriors for racial justice throughout our history, including Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King, John Lewis, I quote all of them in my book. In fact, when I got the index, I could see that the person who was quoted more often than anybody else is Barack Obama. This was a message that he stressed over and over again toward the end of his presidency as we started to see the rise of student activism on campus for racial justice and other forms of social justice. At the same time, support for freedom of speech seemed to be waning, and Obama over and over again, including his last commencement address at Howard University, of course, a historically black university, said that it is especially incumbent on minority students who are championing equal justice and other social justice causes, that they have a responsibility to themselves and to their community if they are going to be effective in advocating the reforms that they want, that they have to listen to those who oppose them and develop their resilience to the slings and arrows of hateful speech, and also their ability to effectively refute those arguments. It's also true that the leading organizations that have monitored hate crimes and hate groups, namely the Anti-Defamation League and the Southern Poverty Law Center, also oppose censorship. And part of the reason, I think there are many reasons why civil rights organizations and racial justice organizations have taken that position, and one of the reasons is that their speech has historically and to this day been branded as hate speech by their political opponents, right? This is why Martin Luther King wrote his famous letter from a Birmingham jail. His crime was engaging in speech that was seen as offensive and dangerous and threatening, and certainly was hated by those who wielded political power and who opposed the reforms that he was championing. So the concept of counter speech, which is really central to my book and central to American law, it's a term that we lawyers tend to sling about, but it really means nothing more than any kind of expression that in any way counters or curbs or checks either the expression of hateful ideas or any potential harmful impact that can come from that expression. So it can range from, supporting people who are disparaged by the hateful message. It can include trying to dissuade people who are hate mongers, right? I was so inspired by so many efforts that have been successful in reaching out even to people who have been leaders of alt-right and white supremacist organizations. We don't have to give up hope on any of them. There have been many dramatic transformations. There's a whole organization called Life After Hate, which is founded by people who, through the prime of their lives for decades, were not only members but leaders of white supremacist organizations. And as I think I read that the most tweeted tweet of all time, no, it was not from the White House, it was from somebody who used to be in the White House, right after Charlottesville, Barack Obama sent out a tweet that quoted Nelson Mandela. And I'll just paraphrase, so I forgive me, it's not as good as the original, but basically Mandela said, nobody is born hating other people because of the color of their skin or their religion or their gender. If we can be taught to hate, surely we can be taught to love. And it was very inspiring for me to see dramatic examples where that has been the case. Also affirmatively educating about people who and groups who are the targets of hateful speech, to immunize those who might be lured into their camp. So all of this is counter speech, and the decades of experience that other countries have had, starting in the second half of the 20th century. Other countries reaffirmed, some of them had these laws historically, but they passed updated versions of them in a newfound commendable zeal to bring about more integrated egalitarian societies. And yet the experience in European countries, Canada, Australia, South Africa, all of these otherwise comparable countries has been that at best censoring hate speech is ineffective. At worst, it is counterproductive. Actually, these laws, like so many laws, tend to be enforced disproportionately against expression by and on behalf of the very minority groups that are supposed to be, intended to be the beneficiaries. And I was not surprised that was the pattern. We had observed that in this country when government was allowed to suppress hate speech. We obviously observed that pattern with other laws in this country. I mean, drug laws, we all know. Other criminal laws are enforced disproportionately against young, dark-skinned men. Why in the world would we expect hate speech laws to be enforced any differently? And those patterns are not just coincidental. They actually result from the very analysis of those who champion hate speech laws. They say, and I agree, that we have systemic, endemic racism and other forms of discrimination and stereotyping in our criminal justice system. Studies have been done of the civil justice system in every single area of the country, and it shows the same patterns. Lately, we've all seen evidence that all of us as individuals are not immune from the so-called implicit or unconscious or unintended bias that you would expect living in our society and in our culture. So given that inherent discrimination built into our systems and into our own psyches, and of course we are striving to overcome both the systemic and the individual bias, but why in the world would we entrust to those systems and to us flawed individuals what is an inherently subjective power to decide which words are going to be deemed to be sufficiently hated and hateful that they will be suppressed. Now, let me tell you, obviously the concept of hate itself is an emotion. It is irreducibly subjective in nature. And what one person hates and deems to be a hated and hateful message, somebody else cherishes and even thinks is a positive message. So in writing my book, I've been constantly attuned to the many, many different ways that we see the term hate speech, which is an epithet, hurled about in public discourse and political discourse. And if you start looking, you'll, I'm sure, see the same phenomenon, which is that any idea, any expression that anybody hates, they will use that epithet, hate speech. And it's been used even against fake news and revenge porn. And, you know, to give some examples, just let me give you some contrasting examples. Black Lives Matter advocacy has been attacked as hate speech, right? It's been attacked by government officials, by police officers, among others, as conveying hatred against police officers, conveying hatred against white people more generally. Conversely, in contrast, Blue Lives Matter has been denounced as hate speech against African Americans. All Lives Matter has been attacked as hate speech. On some college campuses, even the signs that say protect freedom of speech have been attacked as hate speech. And we do know that the words, the letters, 5 letters, T-R-U-M-P, when chalked on sidewalks or worn on T-shirts or on caps, have been attacked as hate speech. So, you know, I've looked at every single hate speech law that has been enacted all over the world. I've looked at even proposed statutes and hate speech laws, and there is not a single one of them that can eliminate this irreducible vagueness that requires subjective exercise of discretion in enforcing it. I mean, the words tend to be like disparaging or demeaning or degrading. When college campuses first adopted hate speech codes in the late 1980s and early 1990s, I'm proud that the ACLU went to court and successfully challenged the first such code to come before a court. And it used the typical language about words that were stigmatizing, demeaning, and the lawyer for the University of Michigan said, as he had to, that the mere fact that expression was offensive is never enough to justify suppressing it, right? That's a tried and true First Amendment principle. So the judge in the case, Judge Avern Cohn, said, well, how do you distinguish speech that is offensive and therefore constitutionally protected, according to you, from speech that is disparaging or demeaning or degrading and therefore not protected, according to you? And the lawyer's answer was, how do I distinguish that, Your Honor? Very carefully. So even though I admire the humor in the answer, it really is no laughing matter when you figure the consequences in that case were that people were being even expelled from school permanently if they were deemed to be on the wrong side of that line. So let me tell you, let me just take a little pause here. And I want to tell you that there are 2 interrelated and mutually reinforcing points that my book makes overall to support its conclusion. One I have already talked about quite a bit, and that is the pragmatic policy justification for advocating reliance on counterspeech rather than censorship. I told you that in many other countries which do not have the First Amendment by definition, human rights advocates are reaching exactly the same conclusion based only on concerns of what actually works. And let me just cite one organization of many that I could cite. Its acronym is ECRI. It's a European organization that stands for the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance. It is an agency of the European Union that monitors the implementation of hate speech laws, which it had championed very enthusiastically a year or so ago, having studied how these laws have actually worked, which means not worked. ECRI actually said, and this is an exact quote, that counterspeech is much more likely than censorship to actually bring about a cessation or a reduction of hateful speech and actual discrimination. But the other point that I want to make, and the other interrelated support for this approach, has to do with First Amendment principles. Not only First First Amendment principles, actually constitutional law principles, including those under the First Amendment and those under the Equal Protection Clause, and also the Due Process Clause, which has to do with fundamental fairness. All of these very important constitutional values are implicated and reaffirmed by the turning to counterspeech rather than censorship. And the principles, there are two basic principles that are at play here under the Constitution. One is called by lawyers viewpoint neutrality, and the Supreme Court has called that the bedrock principle of the First Amendment, but it's also a bedrock principle of equality or equal protection. And first of all, the principle is that government may never suppress or punish or regulate speech merely because its viewpoint, its message, its idea, or its content is disliked, even hated, even by the vast majority of the community. If it's only the idea or viewpoint that bothers you, then the answer is more speech, not silence. And so the Supreme Court never has, and I should actually, in the book, I use the term, I use quotation marks around the words hate speech every time I use it. Other observers and scholars do the same thing. I'll spare you the air quotes from now on, but please always imagine that. The reason is precisely because it's not a constitutional law or legal term of art, precisely because the Supreme Court never has defined a category of speech based on its hateful or hated content and said, therefore, based on that content or viewpoint, it's excluded from the First Amendment. So it's different from obscenity, which is a legal term of art, which applies to a category of sexually oriented expression that the Supreme Court has defined and said is excluded just because of its viewpoint or its content is excluded from First Amendment protection. But the court has refused to do that with respect to hate speech. And I use the term the way it tends to be used most of the time, which is speech that conveys hateful ideas about individuals or groups, in particular those that have traditionally suffered discrimination or marginalization on the basis of race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, and so forth. So let me give you an example of a recent decision in which the Supreme Court unanimously reaffirmed that viewpoint neutrality principle, thus simultaneously reaffirming not only individual liberty, but also equality and dignity and all of those other values that some people think mistakenly will be advanced by censoring hate speech. It was one of the court's most recent First Amendment decisions, or decisions period. It was issued last summer, and the case was called Mattal versus Tam. It involved Simon Tam, an Asian American rock musician who had a rock band consisting of other Asian American men who were rock musicians, and they named their band The Slants. Obviously, I should have given you a trigger warning, right? That obviously traditionally used as a derogatory ethnic slur. I hope it is equally obvious that that is not the reason why Simon Tam and his other fellow rock musicians chose that name. They chose it for exactly the opposite reason, as a reaffirmation of their pride in their ethnic heritage, their assertion of the dignity of being Asian American by background, the empowerment of reclaiming what had been a slur, reappropriating it, and making it into a badge of dignity and pride. So we had a hate speech law, if you will, that was built into the U.S. Federal trade name statutes, trademark statutes, that said that no trade name could be recognized if it was disparaging or demeaning on the basis of such characteristics as ethnicity. And when the Supreme Court unanimously struck down that statute, it was simultaneously reaffirming values of both individual liberty and equality. And I stressed unanimously. I think we all know how ideologically diverse the Supreme Court is and how divided it usually is on issues of constitutional law. So the fact that everybody from Alito on one end to Sotomayor on the other end and everybody in between strongly reaffirmed that principle, I think shows not only how solidly grounded it is in constitutional law, but really that it is something that behooves all of us, no matter what our own ideas are, that we all benefit through this neutrality with respect to protected expression. Now, speaking of protected expression, I'm sure I have a time limit, so I'm hoping, since I can't see a clock, somebody will give me a 5-minute warning, and I don't see anybody volunteering to do that. I warn you, I could keep you here all night, and no, I don't know that I could keep you here. I could keep myself here. So let me, I want to give you some, I want to turn briefly, if I may, to what has been going on in Europe, because it's to me really, you have the worst of both worlds, where, and I could give examples from Canada and Australia and other countries that enforce hate speech laws. But I'll tell you now something about my personal background. My father was a Holocaust survivor. He was what Hitler's Nuremberg laws called a Jew of the second degree. His father was, quote, Aryan. His mother was Jewish by background. And that, plus as a teenager, he was very active in the anti-Hitler movement politically. For a combination of those reasons, as a teenager, he was put into the Buchenwald forced labor camp. He was young and healthy and strong, at least when he went in, so he was not initially targeted for extermination, but he was made to do cruel and excruciating labor in horrible conditions. Disease was rampant, food was not plentiful. He almost died of pleurisy. My husband and I went and visited. It's just so strange for me to be standing here and telling you that I am the daughter of somebody who was enslaved. And literally, one day before he was scheduled to be sterilized as a right socially undesirable, one day before he was scheduled to be sterilized, he was liberated by American troops. So I'm going to quote somebody else that I quote in the book, a gentleman named R.A. Nair, my ACLU friends know, was the executive director of the ACLU at the time of the infamous Skokie case, when the ACLU in the late 1970s came to the defense of the free speech rights of a group of neo-Nazis to march through Skokie, Illinois, which is a town that had not only a large Jewish population, but at the time a large population of Holocaust survivors. Very poignantly, R.A. Nair himself was a Holocaust survivor, slightly younger than my father, but he had also been born in Berlin. His entire extended family was assassinated, exterminated by the Nazis. He and his immediate family escaped. And R.A. said something that I completely agree with. He said, I love free speech. I love free speech. But much as I love free speech, I loathe the Nazis even more than I love free speech. So if I were convinced that censoring Hitler, censoring Nazis would have prevented their rise to power, would have prevented the Holocaust and genocide, then I would have been all for it. And I agree with that. And many people are surprised to learn that in the Weimar Republic, during which Hitler rose to power, there were hate speech laws that are very similar to the hate speech laws that are being enforced in Germany today. And they were enforced strictly. The leading Jewish organization of the time said most of the prosecutions were handled effectively. But guess what? The Nazis loved it. It gave them a propaganda platform. They got attention and sympathy that they otherwise would not have received. And that is exactly the same strategy that the hate mongers use today. I tell you, when I was writing the book a couple of years ago, I would tell people about Milo Yiannopoulos, and nobody had heard of him. He only became a household word after Berkeley tried to censor him. And you could see he was, beaming from one ear to the other. That was exactly what he needed to get the attention and sympathy that he wanted. So I have to tell you that the Southern Poverty Law Center put out a guide last summer to college students because of indications that white supremacists were going to be increasing their recruiting efforts on campus. And the Southern Poverty Law Center was telling students, here are strategies that will be effective in countering the alt-right, and they said, strategy number one, we know it's not satisfying, but please resist the urge to try to suppress them, to try to shout them down, to engage in vigorous in-your-face counter-protests that may be morally satisfying, but you are just playing into their strategy. So what did go wrong in Nazi Germany was that, or pre-Nazi Germany, was that the Nazis got away with murder, literally. They were committing assaults and violence and even killing their political opponents and Jews and members of other minority groups. So the analogy would be as if in this country we made no effort at all to protect civil rights demonstrators and to prosecute those who did commit horrendous violence against them. I want to say a word about what's going on in Germany today. You understand that it's particularly poignant for me. I hope that you've all followed some of the horrific, well-publicized incidents of anti-Semitic violence. I mean, there's basically, the European critics are pointing to increasing amounts of not only discriminatory language, but horrible violence against Jews, against immigrants, against Muslims, against Roma, against other minority groups. And all of those who are observing this situation are saying across the continent and in the United Kingdom as well, the strict enforcement of hate speech laws has not led to a decrease in violence. The violence, sadly, is increasing. So to take Germany, just for an example, one of the most recent incidents that was fairly well publicized was there have been so many attacks against Jews that the head of the Jewish community in Germany issued an edict, I mean, not enforceable, but advice, right, to the Jews who remain in Germany, saying, do not wear the kippah, the skull cap, which many observant Jews believe that they have a religious obligation, a sign of respect to God, to wear this. He said, do not wear it in public, because it is too dangerous. You will make yourself a target of violence. And I get chills every time I think about this. Here in the 21st century, a democratic republic, one that has brought us the Holocaust and has massively atoned for that, for a Jewish leader to be saying, violate your religious principles, your deepest religious beliefs, your identity as an individual and as a member of a community. So a couple of weeks ago, there was an incident where an Arab Israeli was visiting a friend in Berlin, and he was told about this edict, and he was incredulous. He said, that can't be. You can't get in trouble or be a target for wearing a kippah. So he borrowed one from his friend and went out into a public place, and not only a public place, but it was a trendy, hip neighborhood in Berlin, I suppose the equivalent of where we are right now in Little Rock, right, in Berlin, and he was promptly attacked, not only verbally with very ugly language referring to his supposed Judaism, which he wasn't, but he was wearing the kippah, and all of this, of course, and he was physically beaten very severely, and all of this, of course, was captured on a cell phone. Even before this happened in January, because of the incidents that had already occurred, Angela Merkel, for the very first time in German history, appointed a cabinet-level commissioner on anti-Semitism. And a few days later, April 20th, was Israeli Independence Day. Bret Stephens, who's a columnist for the New York Times, was writing about this problem, using Germany as an example, but my friends, it's going on in France and Sweden and the United Kingdom, throughout Europe. And Bret Stephens actually said, and I have this quote as well, he said, "To be a Jew in Europe now is to be living on borrowed time." And again, I'm using it as an example because you know I relate to it personally, but it applies to so many other persecuted minorities in Europe as well. So they have like the worst of both worlds. There is no safety. There is a lot of deterioration in terms of equality, equal opportunity on the one hand, and on the other hand, even speech about vital public policy issues that are the lifeblood of a democracy are being punished and silenced as hate speech. So to take, let me take an example from France, which also is having very severe problems. The Le Monde newspaper, which is sort of like the New York Times of France, very mainstream, generally well respected. France has such, along with Germany, has such a strict definition of anti-Semitic speech that it includes even criticism of a particular policy of the Israeli government. And Le Monde newspaper actually was criminally convicted and fined because of criticizing a single policy of the Israeli government. You know, and to give you another example from France, I told you that these laws are disproportionately enforced against people who are advocating equality and equal rights. So a good example from France is very recently the head of an LGBT rights organization in Paris was criminally convicted. Fortunately, she wasn't sent to prison, but she received a very steep fine. As I recall, it was about $5,000 for using the word homophobe to describe the head of an anti-LGBT rights organization. And I could give you many examples, but I don't know what the time is, but I feel it's time for me to turn to audience questions. Let me just take a look at my notes here. So, yeah, I guess I'll say, since this is an institution that is dedicated to public service, that I don't see any way that we could effectively effectively carry out our responsibility as those who want to engage in public service if we were subject to the suppression of these laws. So the first words in the Constitution, of course, are we the people, right? We the people are the governors. We have ultimate political power. How could we possibly responsibly exercise that power unless we were free to engage in debates with ourselves, with political candidates, with elected officials, on especially the most sensitive subjects, such as immigration and racial justice and misogyny and so forth, and yet very serious statements of that sort are constantly targeted in Europe. And I'll confine myself to just one example. There was, from the United Kingdom, a candidate for the European Parliament was giving a campaign speech, and like many people, he was negative about immigration policies, especially involving Muslims. Now, many of us, or people from Muslim countries, many of us may not share that view, although I think it's interesting that his particular reason for being concerned was what he saw as gender discrimination involved on at least the part of some members of the Islamic community, and at least that was the argument that he was making. So in his speech, so he's standing on the steps of a town hall, right, and, quintessential scene for speaking to your would-be constituents, and he is reading to them a passage from a book that was written by Winston Churchill when Churchill was a young member of the military fighting the so-called River Wars. And Churchill made a statement that was critical of the term Churchill used was Mohammedanism, and the specific basis that Churchill gave for critiquing Mohammedanism was that women were treated as subject first to their fathers and then to their husbands. So I'm not going to comment on the merits of the observation, but somebody or more than one person in the audience complained, which and charged this gentleman, this politician, with violating Britain's anti-hate speech laws, whereupon at least 6 police officers arrived on the scene. By some accounts, it was more than 6, but at least 6. They arrested him. They put him in a paddy wagon. They drove him down to the police station, and they charged him with committing a criminal hate speech offense. After holding him for a while, they decided that they were not going to press charges, but they released him only with a warning that if he did that again, they might well press charges. And no less surprising a person than his opponent in that campaign for the European Parliament wrote an editorial saying, can you believe this? A politician in a democratic country is arrested for giving a hustings speech? How can this be? And unfortunately, there are many other examples. So I'm going to end where I began before I turn it over to you to exercise your free speech rights, which is that there is so much that we can and must do. I've got an entire chapter in the book with strategies for effective counterspeech, and it's well summed up on my favorite ACLU t-shirt of all times, which tells us about the most precious right of all, the right not to remain silent. Thank you very much.
That's great. All right, we have time for questions. If you'll raise your hand and wait for the microphone to get to you. Okay, here comes the microphone.
As a lifelong supporter of, I'm ready. Sorry.
Oh, hi.
Hi. As a lifelong supporter of civil liberties, do you agree with your colleague, Professor Dershowitz, on his recent statements regarding the FBI's raid of Michael Cohen's office and home, as warrant or not, as a violation of civil liberties, given its encroachment on the attorney-client privilege and the Sixth Amendment right?
I am not an expert in that area. I know that there is the so-called fraud crime exception to attorney-client privilege, and I've read the what to me was a persuasive statement by David Cole, who is the ACLU's legal director, who does have a lot of experience in criminal law, and I thought it was very persuasive that the exception was warranted in this case. So I urge you to take a look at that, but I have no independent expertise.
Other questions? Rita?
Well, somebody else.
Well, that's okay. Go ahead and take yours. We'll get around.
Hi, Rita Sklar, Executive Director of the ACLU of Arkansas. I often hear from people that hate speech is more than offensive, that it crosses a line into making people feel physically threatened. How do you respond to that?
Those are 2 points, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to make them. First of all, I told you that speech, including hate speech, may never be suppressed merely because we loathe its viewpoint. So it can't be punished just because of its content. However, hate speech, along with speech that has any message or viewpoint, may be punished under our legal system appropriately if in a particular context it directly causes specific, imminent, serious harm. And one of those types of harms is what the court calls a true threat, okay? Not the way we use the word threat very loosely in everyday speech, but where the speaker, first of all, is addressing either an individual or a small group of individuals, targeting the expression at them, and the speaker means to instill a reasonable fear that the audience is going to be subject to a violence or some kind of lawless conduct. And it has to be an objective fear, not, subjectively, I feel afraid, but a reasonable person standard. So if it actually is a threat, or there are other examples, targeted harassment, intentional incitement of imminent violence. But if it doesn't have that direct, immediate connection to specific serious harm, then it's just that it makes me, and I don't mean at all to trivialize this, that it makes me feel uncomfortable, or I'm afraid that it might have a speculative, indirect connection to harm sometime in the future. That cannot be a justification for censorship. That's the standard that we used to enforce in this country. It was called the so-called bad tendency or harmful tendency test, and that was the standard under which we had the incarceration of civil rights demonstrators and anti-war demonstrators. Eugene Debs, a serious candidate for president, because, as Oliver Wendell Holmes said, all speech is every idea is an incitement in the sense that it might possibly lead to harm at some time in the future. And so that loose standard becomes a license for government, in effect, to suppress ideas that it dislikes.
Was there a question back here? No, here's one right here then.
Thank you, Skip. Could I get you to comment on a recent Duke professor who was confronted while getting lunch with some music that was saying the N-word in a divisive, derogatory manner? And his actions, instead of counterspeech, I guess, his actions led to a couple of people getting fired. Could I get your reaction?
I'm not familiar with that incident at all. Can you give me a little bit more of the factual background? You said his actions led to some people getting fired. What exactly?
A Duke University administrator was getting a sandwich, on campus. And a concessionaire that is contracted by Duke University to provide lunch. The staff had chosen the list play of songs that are being played for the public to listen to. One of the songs, which has the N-word used frequently in a derogatory manner. And so he made comments to the staff person about it. The staff person said, I'm sorry. Stop the playing. But later, she was fired by her supervisor.
Well, based on that description, I don't think that is a justification for firing her. Does hearing, first of all, I know a lot of rap music, right, and hip-hop music contains the word, not necessarily in a negative sense, right? And I'm curious, this is just one factor, but what was the race of the staff person? Do you know? What was the rate? You don't know. Because I know a lot of African Americans produce that music and use that music. That's a factor. But I would say, there was no, and especially with the apology, once she realized that she was offending that person, I would defend her free speech right in her workplace to listen to whatever music that she wants to. There is a concept of a workplace or an educational setting, and this was both, right? For some people it's a workplace, for other people it's an educational setting. You may not have what the court has called a hostile environment, right? And I think that concept is a worthy one, that if you take down the barriers against, that have completely excluded people of a certain race, but you then, so you're not refusing to hire them, but you then subject them to a workplace or to an educational environment that is so hostile that they are denied meaningful equality, that is a violation of equal protection concerns and of our anti-discrimination laws. But the Supreme Court has, I think, defined that category with appropriate narrowness, especially when expression is involved, given how important it is to protect expression, especially in an educational setting. So the court has said that expression can rise to the level of a hostile environment in workplace or educational settings if it is so severe, pervasive, and there's one other adjective. Anybody remember it? At least severe and pervasive. There's one other adjective which connotes repetitive. That it effectively. And the concept is objectively, right? So it's got to be by a reasonable person standard, not by some particular individual who has a negative subjective reaction. That it effectively deprives that person of an equal opportunity or creates an abusive environment. So I'm telling you that's what the standard is that the Supreme Court has laid out. I personally think that is an appropriate standard. We can debate, number one, is that the appropriate standard? And number two, does that speech satisfy that standard? And my answers to both questions are yes, it is the appropriate standard, and no, that speech doesn't satisfy it, but I'm sure other people have different views on both of those questions. So thank you for raising it.
Listen, I know we got some people with questions, but we also need to have some time to sign this book. So I hope you will come purchase your own copy of Hate, Why We Should Resist It, with free speech, not censorship. Nadine, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you all so much. Thank you very much. Thank you.